Flatiron gunboat. Flatiron gunboats, more formally known as Rendel gunboats, were a number of classes of coastal gunboats generally characterized by small size, low freeboard, the absence of masts, and the mounting of a single non-traversing large gun aimed by pointing the vessel. They acquired their nickname from the physical similarity with the flat iron used for ironing clothes during the 19th century. The first Flatiron gunboat was launched in 1867 and the last in 1894, with the vast majority being built in the years 1870–1880. They were designed as a cheap coastal defense weapon, a role they failed to achieve successfully. They found their greatest utility in offensive coastal bombardment. Strongly built, they lasted in some cases into the late 20th century and saw action in both world wars. The hull of the British Flatiron Medway lies in shallow water off Bermuda. The Norwegian Flatiron remains in service under the name Bjorn West, at last report entering Eidsvik shipyard in May 2014 for restoration. Origin. In 1867, Sir W. G. Armstrong and Company signed an agreement with the local shipbuilder, Dr. Charles Mitchell, whereby Mitchell Shipyard would build warships and Armstrong's company would provide the armaments. George Rendel was put in charge of the new venture, and the vessels designed under his leadership were based on a small craft used by the Armstrong factory to test heavy guns. With the assistance of the leading gunnery expert Admiral Sir Astley Cooper Key, he turned these craft into a gunboat designed for defensive coastal operations. Description. A typical Flatiron gunboat displaced about 250 tons, had a length of less than 100 foot and drew only 6 foot. It was armed with a single large gun, normally 10 to 12 inches, but in the case of the Italian Castle class, a massive 16-inch weapon. The gun, which was mounted at the bow, was designed to be raised and lowered on a hydraulic mechanism so that stability would not be compromised when making sea passages. The gun was aimed by pointing the whole vessel, since the mounting allowed for elevation, but not traversing in the manner of an enormous punt gun. No rigging of any sort was provided, and twin screws were fitted, allowing for a much reduced draft while at the same time making them highly maneuverable. Top speed would have been less than 9 kn, but they were designed to be towed at considerably higher speeds, and they were capable of making under their own power. The crew would have numbered about 30 men. Larger variations were built, with the German West class displacing as much as 1157 tons. Masted versions were produced, particularly for navies with inadequate coaling facilities and long coastlines, and commensurate with an increase in displacement, armament and rigging, crews increased to match, with the West class needing 76 men. The original design was intended for defensive coastal operations, but was employed by the Royal Navy largely for offensive coastal bombardment, and in this sense was a natural successor to the Crimean gunboats of the Great Armament and the bomb vessels of the Napoleonic Wars. Operations of this nature require command of the sea, a situation which the Royal Navy could impose by virtue of its battle fleet throughout the period. Few other navies of the time could hope to exercise much more than local sea control for limited periods, and these vessels were of limited use for shore bombardment in the hands of smaller or less effective operators. Nevertheless, these small vessels with their powerful punch were clearly attractive to the small and medium-sized navies of the late 19th century, since they offered the status of big guns without the cost of large warships. This may account for some of the later vessels carrying monstrous 15 and 16-inch guns. Flatirons armed in this fashion were not used for long, probably because their weapons were all but useless except against a stationary target in a flat calm. The defining failure of Flatiron gunboats as coastal defense weapons was in China, where British-built gunboats were used against the French at the Battle of Fuzhou and the Japanese at the Battle of Waiheiwei. In general, the Flatiron gunboats found themselves outmaneuvered and smothered by shell fire from the more stable enemy cruisers. Many failed to get off more than 1 or 2 shots. In contrast to their failure as coastal defense gunboats, the occasions when they were used for coastal bombardment were more successful. Argentine gunboats were used in 1890 to bombard rebels during the Revolution of the Puck. Greek gunboats bombarded Turkish forces during the Greco-Turkish War of 1897, and both Bastard and Exxon, formerly HMS Handy, were part of the force that bombarded the Belgian coast during World War I. According to Professor Andrew Lambert, the Royal Navy Flatiron succeeded in their task of deterrence, and were a key asset to the capability of coastal offensive operations. Australia. The Australian colonies of the British Empire purchased a number of gunboats for coastal defence during the 1880s, and while they were described as Flatirons, They were masted, and Protector was almost the size of a light cruiser. The remains of both Protector and Gayander remain visible today. Argentina purchased 4 flat iron gunboats from their brothers, Birkenhead and J&G Rennie and Co., Greenwich, and in 1875 they were grouped in 2 classes, Pilcomayo and Constitucion. Described as bombarders in Argentina, they were later variously employed as tankers, transports and pontoons, in some cases into the 1950s. Chile. The Chilean government entered into talks to purchase 2 vessels similar to the Argentine units, but did not see the purchase through. China. Between 1875 and 1880, China purchased 13 flat iron gunboats from Britain and built another Tianjin at Shanghai. After the 2 Tianjin class, the British-built boats were given names from the Greek alphabet, from alpha through to lambda, thus becoming known as the alphabetical gunboats. Although quickly given Chinese names, the class names seem to have stuck. A further pseudo-Rendel gunboat, Hoi Tung Hung, was built locally to the lines of the alphabetical flat irons, but constructed from wood-sheathed iron. Fasheng and Tianjin were lost in the Battle of Foshu in 1884 at the beginning of the Sino-French War. 4 Chinese Rendel gunboats also took part in the Battle of the Yalu River against the Japanese in 1894. 8 Chinese flat iron gunboats were sunk or captured by Japan at the Battle of Waiheiwei in 1895. Image: Jinshan gunboat JPG, Chinese Jinshan class gunboat Jinshan, Chinese letter file, Chinese Rendel gunboat Longsang JPG, Chinese Alpha class gunboat Longsang, Chinese letter. Denmark. 5 boats in 3 classes were built in Danish shipyards in 1874 to 1876. 3 were decommissioned at the turn of the 20th century, and the other 2 were decommissioned after World War I, having served as repair ships. Germany. The German Navy Kaiserliche Marine built 11 large Rendel gunboats, Panzerkanonenboot of the West class at AG Weser, Bremen between 1875 and 1881. 1 SMS Salamander was lost in 1910. 2 smaller gunboats of Bremer class were built later in 1884. Greece. In 1881, Greece had 2 Rendel gunboats built at the Thames Ironworks and Shipbuilding Company for the shallow waters of the Ambracian Gulf. They saw action in the Greco-Turkish War of 1897 and Balkan Wars, served the Piraeus and Chersonean net barrage during World War I, and was scrapped after World War I. Italy. Italy built 2 Rendel gunboats at Spezia Dockyard in 1874. In the late 1880s, 2 large Rendel gunboats were designed and built by Armstrong Mitchell and Company's Eidsvik Works to a contract by the Italian War Ministry. They were constructed in Eidsvik Tyneside Yard in the United Kingdom, disassembled and shipped to Italy for reassembly in the Armstrong facility at Pozzuoli. Japan. Japan captured 6 Rendel gunboats from China on 12 February 1895 at the Battle of Waiheiwei. They were listed for disposal in 1906 and broken up by 1907. Mexico. 2 gunboats were commissioned from Armstrong's in 1875, but appear to have been heavily spoiled, single-screw iron gunboats with an extensive sail area. Their short, broad dimensions and single large gun caused them to be taken for flat irons, but illustrations showed that they are not of the same type. They were scrapped in 1920. Netherlands. 31 flat iron gunboats were built in the Dutch shipyards Christie, Nollet and de Kuiper and Vage Noordmidge in the years 1870 to 1880. The Harleys and the Hydra class were nearly all decommissioned before World War I, and Tuspoa was retained until 1960 as a training ship. Arnbrack sank in 1902. 10 of the Wadden class lasted long enough to be sunk or captured by the advancing German army in 1940. Norway. 8 flat iron gunboats were built to a British design in Norwegian shipyards. They were all refitted as minelayers before World War I. Aja was decommissioned in 1932, but the others were all captured by Germany in 1940, and with the exception of Ulla, they survived WW2. They were gradually decommissioned by the Royal Norwegian Navy after World War II, but the Gore-class gunboat was still operating as a civilian ferry Bjorn West 100 years after she was built. Russia. Russia built 10 Rendel gunboats in 3 classes between 1874 and 1881. 2 Savage-class gunboats were also constructed, which had a brig rig later replaced by a ship rig, and later stilt-rigged. They were armed with a single 9-inch gun and a single 6-inch gun aft. Visually, they were very similar to the British Medina class. Sweden. Sweden built 10 Rendel gunboats in Stockholm and Norrköping between 1868 and 1876. United Kingdom. The Royal Navy had two classes of flat-iron gunboats built in the 1870s and 1880s, and several one-off prototypes. As built, they were equipped with a single 9 or 10-inch muzzle-loading rifled gun MLR. They were of sound construction, and many stayed in service in support roles, with a number ending up as gunnery tenders, lighters, tank vessels, and dredges. One notable gunnery tender was Bustard, which was rearmed prior to World War I. During World War I, Bustard, Drudge and Handy renamed Excellent from 1891, and possibly must have renamed Snapper in 1914, and took part in a bombardment of the Belgian coast. The majority of the flat-iron gunboats had been scrapped before the mid-20th century, but Handy survived until she was broken up in 2008 amid safety concerns. For many years, it was assumed that the Royal Navy flat-irons were a failure at their perceived role of coastal defense. Professor Andrew Lambert later argued powerfully that they were designed for coastal assault as successors to the gunboats of their Crimean War-grade armament, and that they succeeded in a deterrent role. He describes them as a part of a sophisticated, layered approach to the tactical problem of defeating large-scale coastal defense systems. The Royal Navy listed them as gunboats for the attack and defense of coasts in its confidential pink list. Due to their lack of speed and limited armament, they were of little value in defense of a coast or harbour, but they were ideally suited for bombardment of shore fortifications where the Royal Navy enjoyed complete command of the sea. Staunch and Plucky were essentially prototypes built in 1867 and 1870. Handy and Drudge were built in the 1880s for testing the mounting of 13.5-inch guns intended for the S. The Medway class were a development of the flat-iron concept, which resulted in an iron coastal gunboat fitted with 3 masts and carrying 3 6.3-inch 64-pounder rifled muzzle-loading guns. Naval historian Anthony Preston described them as the most grotesque craft ever seen. The hull of Medway remains visible on satellite imagery.